Collection blog hop. Here is one of my projects. I love this project. I love doing the ink swipe technique. You've seen me do it before, and if you've taken my Stampscapes class, you've seen me do it a lot. But here is a fun project using lots of Catherine Pooler inks and some of these amazing silhouettes from the Wild Garden stamp set. So to get started, you're going to need some glossy cardstock. I'm using Chroma Coat 10-point cardstock and a color box stylus. This is the sponge stylus. It has several different types of tool endings. You can see me taking off one right there. This happens to be the sponge one. The ink swipe technique is basically swiping ink across your cardstock. You cannot do this on regular cardstock. You really need glossy cardstock. It helps give you that glide. But what's more important is you cannot do this effectively without the proper ink. Not every ink works. For example, Stampin' Up! Inks, they dry too quickly, so I can't work with those in this particular technique. Catherine Pooler inks stay a little bit wetter longer, which is wonderful. A couple of Ranger inks also stay a little wetter. They've discontinued the one that is the best, which is the Adirondack collection, but Catherine Pooler is a phenomenal ink to use for this actual technique. And I do this technique a lot when I do any sort of scenic stamping. I love creating these amazing layered backgrounds, and that's what we're doing here. We started off with the Tiara ink, which is the yellow that I'm using, and you can see that I'm laying down a foundation. That's really what you want to do when creating this. You want to leave lots of gaps of white in the middle because those are going to get filled in with the various colors that we're going to use. And you can see I have lots of colors laid out around me, and we're going to use even more than you see there. And that helps create the magic that this scene has. Next up is Tiki Torch, and just like I do with anything, I always start lightest and then end with darkest because it's much easier to build up and you cannot take away with this technique. You can see that real beautiful color just being laid down, and it kind of blends a little bit with the Tiara ink that's underneath it, and it creates a real warmth to the card, but more importantly, I'm laying the foundation. You know, in a sunset, you have these different layers of color, and I always like to have the yellow kind of close to the horizon, and then we'll work into different colors like reds and purples, and then end up with some blues that we will mix with some purples to create some really incredible shades. And then we'll do a little bit more at the bottom to resemble water before we stamp our scene and edge the entire scene as well. When working with the color box stylus tool, it's important to keep your tool, the tip down on the paper. The actual part that's closest to me is actually slightly raised. I never have it completely laying flat because if I did, I would get an impression of that oval, and that's really not what I'm going for. So what I'm doing, a lot of times you'll see me tapping the tool just at the edge, and here we just did a little bit with the orange twist, and now we're moving into Tutti Frutti, which is a reddish orange kind of hue. And it's a beautiful color. I'm totally addicted to Tutti Frutti. I've been using it a lot. You can see me just kind of tapping that tool there at the edge, and what I'm doing is I'm just collecting some color there, and then from that I'm dragging it across the paper. It is important that you're using the proper ink. If you're not using the proper ink, like I said, if you have an ink that's too dry or you're not creating a foundation before you're swiping, you can actually tear your tool. That sponge tool is very delicate, and I've torn several of these. I always recommend when you get the color box stylus tool that you get a little package of extra tips, especially if you're new to the technique. It's very common to tear a couple, and that doesn't mean you can't really use it. It's not as effective, but you can certainly use it for other things, maybe doing some of the edging or, you know, framing of the card itself. But you can see here that we're starting to build our color, and now I'm moved on to Rocking Red. I didn't add a lot of Tutti Frutti. It's, you know, these are really strong colors, the Rocking Red, and you can see me cleaning up in between. That's important too, because whatever ink is left on the craft mat, I have the opportunity to drag onto my piece, and I certainly don't want to mix colors and have it not work. So now it's going to be kind of funny because I have this really bright, vibrant red, and then I'm moving on to It's a Boy, which is about as light a shade of blue as you can get. But what I'm doing is, and you're never going to really see the It's a Boy up top, but I'm just laying a foundation because that cardstock is completely dry up there. So I'm kind of coating my cardstock. You can see that I grabbed a piece of scrap paper to cover the rest. I don't want to get fingerprints in all those colors because they are still being soaked into the paper, and it's very easy to do that. And once oils from your finger transfer to the paper, with this technique, it is glossy cardstock. Anything you put over it, you are going to see the fingerprint. It will remain. So I've moved on to Fiesta Blue, and Fiesta Blue is kind of a little bit more of a true blue. And then we're going to move on to Something Borrowed even to just intensify it. And I just kind of go up the scale, you know, going from lighter to darkest. And then after Something Borrowed, I'm going to bring in a purple. I decided not to use It's a Girl. And that party dress I ended up not using either. But I did end up using both of those purples, the Pixie Dust and the Flirty Fuchsia, after the Something Borrowed. And it really created something amazing. I love mixing purple and blue. Purple and blue together really make an amazing deep dark indigo. Now we're not going fully dark here, but you can see that going from that red to the blue, it just wasn't enough. I needed to work the purple in. And now that I'm working the purple in, then it all kind of made sense. And that kind of gave us that depth in the upper layer of the sky that I was looking for. You can see I had a little bit of pixie dust there, and now I'm adding the Flirty Fuchsia. And Flirty Fuchsia is a pretty vibrant color, but mixed, it's really pretty. And the thing that I love about this top part here, and you'll see this in the close-ups at the end of the video, is you have that blue, or that mix of blue and purple there, and then you have that bright spot of purple in the middle, and that's where leaving those little white gaps, you know, being careful not to fill in your card completely, that's the magic of the ink swipe technique, and creating like sunsets and skies and aurora borealises and all sorts of fun things that you can do with this technique. And I'm even bringing the purple in down a little further, and that's going to give us a little tiny sliver of purple down in those white gaps. I'm being, you know, cognizant not to layer too much purple down there because I don't want it to overtake the scene. I want to preserve some of that orange and red and other colors. But here you'll see it right here. See that purple, how it just got laid into that little white area, and that's that magic. I love it. This is such a fun technique, and there's so much that you can do. And I know it looks a little awkward right now where that transition is, and that's kind of what I'm pointing to. But when we do our framing, that's where we're going to cover that up, and you won't even notice it. So now we're going to move on a little bit, and I have some Bellini, and Bellini is a fun little color. We're going to work it a little bit further down. We're actually going to deposit it a little bit all over, not have it be too heavy, but Bellini I find, I'm adding a little to the top, but Bellini I do find is a great transition color between yellow and blue. Because when you mix yellow and blue, what you really get is green, and that Bellini kind of gives you that little bit of buffer where you're not dragging too much blue into your yellow. I do this all the time when I do other types of techniques, especially sponging or brayering. And adding this layer of color, you can see I'm pointing to where I'm going to actually add my water, and that's the Aquatini that's next. Even though it's not a true blue, Aquatini still mixed with yellow will create a shade of green. And you don't really want that. So that Bellini helps to be that buffer between the two colors. You may get a little teeny tiny bit that overlaps, but you aren't going to really see it. And it's a nice tool to have. I'm always worried about blending my yellows and blues in scenic scenes like this. You know, I learned how to do this technique by watching Kevin Nakagawa, artist, illustrator, and owner of Stampscape Stamps. They're really more scenic stamps, and I'm really big into scenic stamping, and I learned how to do this technique by watching him, and having Catherine Pooler inks work for this technique is really great for me, because so many of the inks that I've used over the years, Marvy Matchables, the Adirondacks, you know, they've been discontinued either here in the United States or completely, and that's a little frustrating. So it's exciting to have inks that actually work well with this technique, because I love to scenic stamp. And when I saw the Wild Garden stamp set, I I knew I was going to create this card immediately. This was the first card that popped into my mind. Now you just saw me layer in some more tiara. I was brightening up that scene, and look at that. I mean, those colors are amazing, right? Now I jumped a little ahead. You've seen me. We're going to do a lot of framing. I didn't think that you needed to watch it all, but you're going to see enough of it. You can see I have 2 black inks up there. One is the Catherine Pooler Midnight, which is essentially the ink that I used on this card. But I thought it would be good to showcase Memento black here. And you can see that it does work. Memento is an ink that I use for this technique, but actually the Catherine Pooler actually worked a little better, which was really exciting. I can't tell you how excited I am to have a new set of inks for this technique because, like I said, I do a lot of scenic stamping. And the Midnight was so intense. It was such a deep, rich black. It really popped on the glossy cardstock. And you can see here what I'm doing when I'm framing is I'm doing like I did the rest of the card. I'm adding a little bit there to the edge, and I'm strategically dragging it across. And remember when I said, you know, we have kind of that funky little transition in certain spots, especially where the red went to the bluish purple. This is where you can hide that, and the card just completely comes together. But you want to be careful. You don't want to do it just everywhere evenly. You want to kind of stagger those swipes that come across, and you'll see what I mean. Now on the bottom, this card goes through so many ugly duckling phases. It's actually quite funny. You just have to keep going with it. And then at the end, you really, truly, I've used the word magical several times. I don't know how else to describe it. It really is true magic. The corners are really important. You can see me layering down a lot in the corners there. Look at that. See, it's still kind of funky, but then once the silhouettes come down on top of it, it's all going to come together. Here is where I'm being very strategic up top, because this is where it's pretty much just sky. Nothing's going to be layered too much there. So I have one big swipe there. I'm adding a lot of black there on the edge. And then I'm going to end up flipping it around. And you can see I have 2 prominent swipes. I'm going to add one right into the middle of that. First, I'm going to add a little more to the top there. You're just going to have to do this a little at a time. You build up your color. Initially, when you add your black, it almost looks a little gray. You'll need to come back and deposit. And that's what I'm doing here is I'm depositing a lot on the edge so that you have that intense color. And here's that strategic swipe that I was talking about. See how it kind of staggers? You want to have that in areas where you aren't really going to have anything that's covering it. So once you've allowed that to dry, I'm going to take the Midnight ink. I've positioned some stamps onto my scene here using my MISTI. Stamping is, keep in mind, it's glossy cardstock. A MISTI does come in handy. You don't have to have a MISTI to do this. I certainly did it for years without a MISTI, but sometimes I would have to get out my repositioning tool and have to put another one over. But it's glossy cardstock, so you can very easily move your stamps. And I ended up doing that towards the end here where I added some extra little stamps. I was impatient and I didn't want to use the MISTI for everything because I'm a quick stamper. I am not one who likes to take my time. But being that these were so prominent and I had just spent all that time on the background, I didn't want to mess it up. But remember, I did say you have to allow your background to dry in between because you don't want to put all these magnets and other things on top of it if the color hasn't properly soaked into the glossy cardstock. Because it's glossy cardstock, it is a coated cardstock. It's actually cast coated. You have to give it some time to really soak in. It's going to repel a little bit, and that's the fun of using a cast coated cardstock is you have time to swipe and move and do fun things, unlike regular cardstock where the ink immediately soaks in. So you can see here we're adding some more silhouettes there. I'm doing a little CPR right there on my MISTI to get that. I really needed to do 2 stamps to get that really nice deep black. But look at that. It's very, very cool, right? Now there's lots of gaps there. You could leave it like that, but I felt that it needed to be filled in a little tiny bit. So here I'm doing a little bit of regular stamping. And like I said, if you're doing it this way, take your time. It's my best advice is take your time. It is so easy to move. And I actually moved this one because I got really quick and impatient. And you can't tell too much. I didn't do it too badly, but it's very, very easy to smear and smudge your stamps. Now that one I should have done at a different angle. That was a little too similar, but that's okay. You probably would have never noticed if I didn't say something. Maybe you would have, who knows? I'm a little bit of a perfectionist, if you can't tell, when it comes to this, but these stamps are so much fun. Look at all the possibilities. I mean, I love all the different shapes of the flowers. Such a beautiful little garden. Now here I'm adding 2 butterflies. Got those inked up and just adding those in those spots. Oh, it's just perfect. This is just such a fun stamp set. There is also a matching set of dies. I know that in the release there's a very limited amount. So if you like to do silhouettes with cardstock, that would work too. There's all different things you can do. Oh, but it looks so great. So great. Now I'm going to end up adding a greeting at the top. Now I'm adding this. This is the full, it takes up all the real estate on my card. So I swiped some black down along the edge underneath before gluing that down. And then you can see here I stamped a little on the inside for some simple little touches. I'll also carry that over to the envelope. So what do you think? I love it. It's so great, so pretty. And the fun part about the ink swipe technique is you have that light in the middle, and that just creates a little bit of interest. It really looks like the sun is there, and oh, it's such a beautiful card. I hope you've enjoyed watching me create this with the ink swipe technique and the Catherine Pooler